The day Ethan Calloway's mail-order bride arrived in Hollow Creek, the entire town stopped breathing. Not because she was beautiful, though she was. Not because she smiled at the crowd gathered on the platform, though she did. They stopped breathing because Clara Dorset stepped off that train in a wheelchair, a worn leather suitcase balanced across her lap, and a battered storybook tucked under her arm. And she looked at every single person staring at her like she had expected nothing less. Like she had rehearsed for their silence her whole life. Ethan stood at the edge of the platform with his hat in his hands and his two children pressed against his sides, and for a long moment, he didn't move either. None of them did. The train hissed steam into the cold Montana air, and the woman in the wheelchair lifted her chin and met his eyes, and whatever Ethan Calloway had planned to say died somewhere in his chest. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this tale has traveled. Now stay with me, because what happens next is going to change everything you think you know about strength. The letter had taken 3 weeks to reach him. Ethan found it wedged between a seed catalog and a past due notice from the feed store. The envelope already soft at the corners from being handled too much by the postal clerk, who had clearly read the return address and decided it was interesting enough to turn over twice. He'd taken it inside without opening it, set it on the kitchen table, and stared at it through supper while his twins, Nora and Samuel, argued over the last of the cornbread. He opened it after they were in bed. The letter was from a woman named Clara Dorset, of Richmond, Virginia, responding to the advertisement he had placed in the Prairie Matrimonial Gazette 4 months earlier. He hadn't placed it himself, technically. His neighbor Ruth Hadley had placed it on his behalf after watching him burn the same pot of beans 3 nights running and declaring that the Calloway Ranch was going to kill those children through sheer neglect if something wasn't done. Ethan had signed the form mostly to get Ruth out of his kitchen. He hadn't expected anyone to actually write back. Clara Dorset's letter was 2 pages long, written in a precise, even hand that slanted slightly to the left. She told him she was 28 years old, that she had grown up in Virginia and had worked as a school teacher's assistant until circumstances had made that impossible. She didn't say what the circumstances were, and Ethan had noted that and moved past it. She said she was good with children, that she read widely and cooked adequately and did not expect romance or poetry, only honesty and a fair chance. She said she understood frontier life was hard and that she was not afraid of hard. She did not mention the wheelchair. He found out about it in her second letter, 3 weeks later, written in that same leftward slant. "I must tell you something I should have said from the start," it began, "and I will understand entirely if this changes your decision." She described the accident in 2 sentences, clinical and sparse, the way a person describes something they've had to explain so many times that they've stripped all the feeling out of it just to get through it. She had lost the use of her legs 4 years ago. She managed her own care. She was not a burden in the ways people assumed, but she also would not pretend there were no difficulties because there were, and she had found that pretending never helped anyone. Ethan had read that letter twice, then folded it and put it in his shirt pocket and gone out to fix the fence line along the north pasture. He'd worked until his hands were raw and the sun was low, and then he'd sat on the top rail and looked out at the land his wife Margaret had loved and thought about what it meant to be practical. He wrote back the next morning. He said he appreciated her honesty. He said he still wanted to meet her. He said the children needed someone, and so did the ranch, and if she was willing to come out and see whether it suited her, he would pay for the train ticket. What he didn't say was that Margaret had been gone for 2 years, and the house still felt like a room where someone had just left, where all the furniture was exactly right, but the air was wrong. He didn't say that Nora had stopped talking much since her mother died, or that Samuel had taken to following Ethan around the ranch like a shadow, as though afraid to lose sight of him. He didn't say any of that because it felt like too much to put in a letter to a stranger. Clara Dorset's reply came in 10 days. "I'll be on the westbound train the 15th of October, she wrote. "I travel light. I only ask that someone be there to meet me." The 15th of October came in cold and gray, which was typical for Montana that time of year. Ethan put on his good jacket, the one he only wore to town, and told the children to do the same. Samuel couldn't find his good shirt and settled for the next best one, which had a small tear at the elbow that Ethan didn't notice until they were already in the wagon. Nora wore her blue dress and sat very straight the entire ride into town, the way she did when she was nervous about something and didn't want to show it. "Is she nice?" Samuel asked somewhere around the 2-mile mark. "I don't know," Ethan said. "I've never met her. But from her letters, she seems sensible." Samuel considered this. "Mama wasn't sensible. Mama was funny." "Your mama was both," Ethan said. "Sensible and funny. It's not one or the other." Samuel nodded seriously, as though filing that away. Nora said nothing, just watched the road. The Hollow Creek train station was about as grand as a station in a town of 400 people had any right to be, which was to say it had a proper platform and a ticket window and a bench inside that stayed dry when it rained. On the day Clara Dorset arrived, there were maybe 30 people on or near that platform, some of them waiting for the train, and some of them just there because the train's arrival was one of the notable events of any given week, and there wasn't much else going on. Ethan parked the wagon and helped the children down, and they stood at the edge of the platform. He recognized most of the people around him. There was Hector Mills from the hardware store, and the Dunbar sisters who ran the laundry, and Mayor Aldrich, who made a point of being present for anything that could be considered a civic occasion. Ruth Hadley was there too, of course. Ruth was always where the action was. Standing near the station door in her good coat with her arms crossed, watching Ethan with the expression of someone monitoring an experiment they'd designed themselves. The train came in on schedule, which was unusual enough that a few people remarked on it. Steam poured off the engine in great white billows, and the cars groaned and clattered as they slowed. And then there was that particular stillness when a train finally stops, a held-breath quality to the air. The first passengers to disembark were a family Ethan didn't recognize, probably settlers passing through. Then a traveling salesman with 2 enormous cases, then an older man in a minister's collar who nodded to Mayor Aldrich. And then the porter appeared at the door of the second car, and he was carrying something, folding it out, setting it up, and the platform went quiet before anyone had consciously registered why. The wheelchair came down the ramp the porter set against the car's steps, and Clara Dorset guided it herself, her hands on the wheels with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing this for years. She had dark hair pinned back neatly and a green wool traveling coat that had seen better days but was clean and well pressed. The leather suitcase sat across her lap. The storybook was tucked under one arm, held against her side. She rolled to the edge of the ramp and stopped, and she looked out at the platform, and Ethan watched her face in the moment before she put anything on it, before she arranged her expression, and he saw something there. Not fear, exactly. Something more like bracing. The way a person looks right before they step into cold water. Then it was gone, replaced by a calm, level gaze that moved across the crowd until it found him. He knew it found him because she stopped scanning. Around him, the murmuring had started. He could feel it more than hear it, the shift in the air that happened when people decided something was wrong and wanted to share that opinion with whoever was nearest. "Lord in heaven," someone muttered. He thought it was Hector Mills, but he couldn't be sure. "That's his bride?" That was definitely one of the Dunbar sisters. Ruth Hadley made a sound that might have been a suppressed oath. Ethan moved. He wasn't entirely sure what he was going to do or say when he got to her. He hadn't planned for this. He'd had a version of this moment in his head, some practical greeting, a handshake maybe, the beginning of an arrangement between 2 sensible adults. But the plan dissolved when he got close enough to see that her hands on the wheels were steady but white-knuckled, and that the calm on her face was work, real work, not ease. "Miss Dorset," he said. His voice came out lower than he intended. "Mr. Calloway," she said. Her voice was steady and clear and had a slight Virginia lilt that reminded him, absurdly, of a schoolroom. "I apologize for the spectacle. Disembarking is rarely graceful." "You managed fine," he said. Then, because something about the precision of her response made him want to match it. "Better than the salesman with the 2 cases." "He knocked someone's hat off." She blinked, and then briefly her mouth curved. "I'll try to avoid that. These are my children," he said, and looked back to find that Nora and Samuel had followed him across the platform and were now standing just behind him, Samuel barely coming up to Ethan's elbow, Nora a few inches taller, and watching Clara with an expression he couldn't read. "Hello," Clara said, addressing them directly, not looking at Ethan for permission or guidance. "I'm Clara. Which one of you is which? I'm Samuel, Samuel said immediately, because Samuel never had any trouble talking to people. I'm 8. Nora's 8 too. We're twins, but I'm older by 11 minutes. 11 minutes is significant, Clara said, with great seriousness. Samuel nodded vigorously. That's what I keep telling her. Clara looked at Nora, who had not said anything. Nora was doing the thing she did, the careful measuring thing, where she watched someone with her head tilted slightly and her face giving away nothing. Margaret had done the same thing. It still caught Ethan off guard sometimes. You don't have to say anything, Clara said to Nora, matter-of-factly, not gently. Not the cloying softness that adults usually aimed at quiet children, which Ethan had noticed Nora hated. Sometimes it takes a while to figure out if someone's worth talking to. That's smart, not rude. Nora's expression shifted. Not much, but something. Upcat. They got her bag loaded in the wagon without too much difficulty, though the logistics of it, the bag, the wheelchair, the ramp, required some problem solving on the fly that Ethan suspected was going to be a regular feature of things from here on. Clara was matter-of-fact about all of it, giving clear, brief instructions when asked and not offering them when not asked. She understood the geometry of the chair in a way that made him feel slightly clumsy beside her, a man navigating around an obstacle she simply lived inside. They were pulling out of the station when Ruth Hadley appeared at the side of the wagon. "Ethan," she said, and her voice had that particular tone she used when she thought she was about to say something important for his own good. "Morning, Ruth. We need to speak, when you have a moment." "I've got a full day," he said, which was true. "I'll see you Sunday." Ruth's eyes cut to Clara briefly, and then back to him. She pressed her lips together. "Sunday," she agreed and stepped back. Ethan clicked to the horses and they moved off down the main street. He was aware of the town watching. He could feel it, the same way you could feel a change in weather before it arrived. Something in the quality of the air. Heads turning in doorways, conversations stopping. Clara sat in the wagon bed. He'd helped her up with more difficulty than either of them pretended. With her hands folded over the storybook in her lap, and she looked at Hollow Creek with an expression of mild, careful interest, the way a person looks at a place they're trying to understand before they decide what to think of it. "Not a large town," she said. "No," he agreed. "Is it friendly?" He took a moment with that one. "Some of it," he said. She nodded, like he'd confirmed something she'd already suspected. The ride to the ranch took 40 minutes. Ethan spent most of it answering Samuel's questions about trains, because Samuel had apparently decided that Clara was interesting, and that the best way to include her in the conversation was to ask her about her journey. Clara answered each question with the same directness she'd used on the platform, not simplifying for him exactly, but finding the part of each answer a child would find interesting. She described the dining car with particular care, and Samuel, who had never been on a train in his life, absorbed every detail with reverence. Nora, who was sitting between Ethan and Samuel on the bench seat, said nothing. But at some point she turned around to look at Clara, and Clara caught her looking and didn't make anything of it, just raised her eyebrows slightly. "Well?" And Nora turned back around. A minute later, Nora turned around again. This time Clara said nothing, just looked back at her evenly. Nora faced forward again. Ethan watched this without comment. He didn't entirely understand what was happening, but he had a feeling it was something. The ranch came into view around a bend in the trail. The main house first, then the barn, and the smaller outbuildings behind it. It was not a prosperous-looking property. He knew that. The house needed paint, and the fence along the near pasture was one bad winter from being useless. And the kitchen garden had been more or less abandoned since Margaret died, and he hadn't gotten around to reviving it. The land itself was good land, rolling grassland with a creek running along the western edge. But the ranch as a working operation was limping, and he knew it, and he was aware of Clara seeing it. She didn't say anything about any of that. "The house is single story," she observed. "Yes." "Good." She said it practically, without self-consciousness. He pulled up near the front of the house and helped her down, a more involved operation than helping the children down, requiring the chair to be unfolded and positioned, and a transfer that Clara managed herself, but that Ethan hovered uselessly beside, not sure whether to help or stay out of the way, and opting after a moment of indecision for staying out of the way, which turned out to be the right choice. The doorways? He said, meaning the width of them. Let's see, she said, and they went and saw, and two of the main doorways were fine, and the one to the back room was close but manageable, and the one to the root cellar was not, and she noted all of this without expression, filing it away. He showed her to the room that would be hers. It had been the spare room, used for storing things that didn't have another home, and he had cleaned it out over the past 2 weeks and put a decent bed in it, and a chest of drawers, and a small writing desk that had been in the house since before he bought it. He'd thought it was adequate when he'd finished cleaning it. Standing in it now, with her in the doorway behind him, he thought it looked sparse. "It's fine," she said before he said anything. "I don't need much." "The window faces east," he offered. "Gets morning light. That's the best kind." He left her to settle in and went to start the afternoon chores. The first week was strange in the way that any major change is strange. Not because anything went badly wrong, but because nothing went entirely right either. They were two adults learning to exist in proximity to each other with minimal preparation, and around them were two children watching every interaction for data, and beneath all of it was a ranch that needed constant work and didn't stop needing it because the household was in a transitional state. Clara had been clear in her letters that she did not expect to be kept. She wanted to contribute. The practicalities of what that looked like were something they'd have to work out as they went, and they did, awkwardly, with some false starts. She could cook, she'd said, and that turned out to be accurate. She was not a spectacular cook, but she was a reliable one, which was worth more on a working ranch. She managed the kitchen with calm efficiency, adapting without complaint to the fact that the stove ran hot on the left side and the flour barrel was in a location that required him to move it to a lower shelf before she could reach it. "Tell me what needs doing," she said to him on the second morning, over coffee. Direct, no preamble. He gave her a list. Some of it she could do easily, some of it she couldn't, and they both knew it, and he listed it anyway because she'd asked for honesty, and he didn't see the point in pretending around her. She listened and didn't argue about the items that weren't feasible, just set them aside. And when he was done, she said, "What about the children's schooling?" "There's a schoolhouse in town. They go 3 days a week." "And the other 2 days?" "They're around. Help with what they can." "I could teach them on the other days," she said. "If you'd want that. I have books, and I know the subjects well enough." He looked at her over the rim of his cup. "They're not easy to teach. Samuel talks over everything, and Nora doesn't talk at all." "I noticed." She said it without particular concern. "I've taught harder." He agreed to it, partly because it was sensible, and partly because something about her certainty made him willing to find out if she was right. She was. He came in from the barn on the second Friday afternoon to find the kitchen turned into something he barely recognized. Samuel was at the table with a map spread out in front of him, a real map, big and detailed, and Clara was at his elbow pointing to something on it while Samuel traced routes with his finger and asked questions faster than she could fully answer them. Nora was in the corner chair, which was where Nora always went when she wanted to be present without being noticed, and she had one of Clara's books open in her lap, and was reading, actually reading, which she hadn't done since Margaret's death, because reading had been something she and her mother did together, and she hadn't been able to come back to it. Clara hadn't even been there 2 weeks. Ethan stood in the kitchen doorway and watched for a moment before anyone noticed him, and he felt something move in his chest that he couldn't have named and didn't try to. The trouble came from town, as he'd known it would. Ruth Hadley came out to the ranch that Sunday as promised, and she didn't come alone. She brought her husband Donald and their daughter Patience, ostensibly for a social call. But Donald had never been much for social calls, and Patience spent the entire visit watching Clara from across the room with an expression just barely south of polite. Clara served coffee and cornbread because she'd made it that morning, and there was plenty, and she was civil in a way that managed to be neither warm nor cold. Simply correct. The way a person is civil to people they have accurately assessed. Ruth waited until Clara was back in the kitchen before she leaned toward Ethan. "How is it going?" she said, which was Ruth. "Speak, for I have opinions, and I am about to share them." "Fine," Ethan said. "Ethan, be straight with me." "I am being straight with you. It's going fine." Ruth glanced toward the kitchen. "She can't do the things this ranch needs done." "She does plenty." "I'm not talking about cooking," Ruth said. "I'm talking about... This is frontier life, Ethan. This is not Richmond, Virginia. There are things a rancher's wife has to be able to do that She teaches the children, Ethan said. She runs the kitchen. She manages the household accounts better than I ever have. The children like her. He paused. Nora's reading again. Ruth stopped. Nora started reading again, she said. Started 2 weeks ago. She finished one of Clara's books yesterday and asked for another. Ruth was quiet for a moment. It was the longest he'd ever seen her quiet. She's not what you planned for, she said finally, and it was a different kind of statement than what had come before. No, he agreed. She's not. When Ruth left, she was more subdued than she'd arrived, and Donald nodded to Ethan in a way that meant something Ethan couldn't quite interpret, and Patience said very little except goodbye. That was the easy part. The harder part was Hector Mills, who cornered Ethan at the feed store 2 weeks later and said, with the comfortable authority of a man who had never questioned his own judgment, that people were talking, that it wasn't right what Ethan was doing, that there were other women, suitable women, women who could actually be wives, and that Ethan was doing himself and his children a disservice by settling for something out of misplaced obligation. Obligation, Ethan said. Well, you invited her out, Hector said. And then she showed up the way she did. And you can't just send her back. I understand that. Nobody wants to be the man who... I'm not keeping her out of obligation, Ethan said. Hector looked at him the way a man looks at another man when he thinks the other man is confused about his own situation. Ethan, think practically. I am. He picked up his order and left. He didn't tell Clara about the conversation. He didn't know why exactly. It wasn't as though she'd be surprised by it. She was clearly not surprised by any of it. He'd watched her navigate town on the 2 occasions she'd come with him, and he'd seen how she handled the stares and the silences and the occasional comment aimed just loud enough to be heard, and she handled all of it the same way she'd handled the platform on the day she arrived, like she'd known it was coming and had decided well in advance that it wasn't going to stop her. But one evening, about 3 weeks in, he came inside later than usual and found her at the kitchen table with a notebook open in front of her and her pen set down, not writing, just sitting with her hands flat on the table and looking at something that wasn't there. She heard him come in and straightened, put the pen back in her hand. Supper's on the stove, she said. It needs a few more minutes. Clara, she looked at him. Is everything all right? She looked at him for a moment in a way he couldn't read, then said, The Dunbar sisters were outside the dressmakers when I came back through town today. I heard what they said. She paused. I've heard worse. I'll hear worse again. You don't have to pretend it doesn't bother you, he said. I'm not pretending. She said it simply. It bothers me. But so does a lot of things that I can't change, and I stopped letting things I can't change make the decisions about what I do next. She looked back at the notebook. Your children needed their supper made. That's something I can do. So I did it. He stood there for a moment, in the kitchen doorway, with the smell of supper on the stove and the lamp burning low and the night coming on outside. I know, he said, and he meant something by it he couldn't quite get to yet. I know. He sat down at the table and waited for the supper to be ready, and Clara wrote something in her notebook, and outside the ranch was quiet under the Montana sky. And for the first time in a long time, the kitchen felt occupied in the right way. Not fixed, not healed, nothing that clean, but occupied by people who were at least in the same room and no longer alone. It wasn't much, but on a night at the edge of winter, with the wind picking up along the creek, it was enough to matter. The notebook was a dark green thing, cloth-covered, the corners soft from handling. Ethan had seen it on the kitchen table the night he'd found Clara sitting still with her pen down, and he'd registered it and moved on because it was hers and none of his business. He saw it again on the windowsill in the morning when she was outside with the children, and again on the small writing desk in her room when he passed the open doorway. He didn't think much of it. Everyone had their private things. Margaret had kept letters in a box under the bed that he'd never opened, and he'd loved her for 14 years. What he did not expect was to find it open. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in early November, 5 weeks after Clara arrived. He'd come in from the north pasture earlier than planned because one of the fence posts had snapped clean and he needed wire from the supply room off the kitchen. He came in through the back, the way he always did, and he was already through the door, and reaching for the supply room latch when he saw it. The notebook spread open on the table, pen resting in the spine of it like a bookmark. No one in the room. He could hear Clara in the front of the house. She was reading aloud to Samuel, something with a lot of voices in it, and Samuel kept interrupting to ask questions she answered in stride without losing the thread. Nora was presumably nearby in her corner chair, reading her own book the way she'd taken to doing most afternoons now. Ethan looked at the notebook. He was not a man who read other people's private correspondence. He had been raised to believe that was a fundamental matter of respect, no different from not walking into a room where the door was shut. He stood there with his hand on the supply room latch and looked at the open page and thought about Margaret's letters in the box under the bed, which he still had not opened. He looked away, got the wire, went back out. He made it as far as the barn before he stopped, because in the second it had taken him to look away, he had seen something. Not much. A line, maybe two, written in that left slanting hand, enough to register that the name at the top of the page was not Clara. He stood in the barn doorway with the coil of wire in his hands and the wind coming through the open side doors, and thought about that for a long time. He went back inside. He told himself later that he went back for a second length of wire, and that was true. He did get a second length of wire, but that was not why he went back. He went back because the name he'd seen had not been Clara Dorset, and he did not know what to do with that, and some part of him thought that seeing it again would either explain it or prove he'd misread it. The notebook was still open. He hadn't misread it. Evelyn, it said at the top of the page, not as a name addressed to someone else, as a name belonging to the writer. Evelyn, written the way you write your own name when you're being honest with yourself about who you are. He read two more lines before he stopped himself and stepped back. The writing below the name was private in a way that made him feel the violation of it, even standing still. He turned and went back out to the fence line. He fixed the post badly and had to redo it, which cost him an extra hour, and the whole time his mind was doing something he couldn't shut off. He didn't say anything that evening. He sat across the supper table from her and watched Samuel tell a long and complicated story about something that had happened at the schoolhouse involving a mouse and the teacher's inkwell, and he watched Clara listen with the slightly too careful attention of someone who was also thinking about something else. And he wondered whether she knew she'd left it open, whether she'd left it open on purpose, whether that was even the kind of thing a person did, and if so, what it meant. He didn't say anything the next day either. What he did do, that next day, was watch her more closely than he had been. He'd been keeping a certain kind of distance, practical, sensible, the distance of a man who has an arrangement with a woman he doesn't know yet and is moving carefully. He'd told himself that was respect. And it was, partly. But it was also fear, though he wouldn't have used that word then. Watching her that day, he saw things he'd been too careful to notice before. He saw her with Samuel in the morning. The two of them bent over the big map again, and Samuel said something wrong about the territories, and Clara corrected him not by telling him the right answer, but by asking him a question that made him think his way to it. And Samuel's face when he got there, that specific pride of having figured something out, was a face Ethan recognized because Margaret had done the same thing. That same teaching style, that same patience that didn't feel like patience because it was actually interest. He saw her with Nora in the afternoon. Nora had come to her, and this was the thing. Nora had come to her, had crossed the kitchen and stopped beside Clara's chair and held out the book she'd been reading with her finger on a page. And Clara had taken it and read the passage Nora was pointing at, and the two of them had a conversation. A real conversation, longer than anything Nora had said to anyone outside this house in 6 months. He couldn't hear all of it from where he was standing. He heard Nora say, "But why does she leave?" And Clara say something back, and Nora say, "That's not a good enough reason." And Clara say, very clearly, "No, it's not. That's the point." He went back to work and left them to it, and he thought about the name at the top of that page. The first real fight happened on a Thursday. It wasn't with Clara. It was on her behalf, which was almost worse because it meant he'd reacted before he'd thought, and the thinking came after. He'd gone into town for supplies, and he'd brought Samuel with him because Samuel liked the hardware store, and Donald Hadley sometimes let him organize the small nails into their bins, which Samuel treated as an important commission. They were loading the wagon when Roy Engel from the neighboring spread came down the street with two of his ranch hands and stopped beside the wagon with the kind of deliberate casualness that meant he'd been waiting for an opportunity. "Calloway," Roy said. "Roy, heard your mail-order girl settled in." "She did." Roy exchanged a look with one of his hands, a quick sideways thing that Ethan had seen 100 times in various forms, the look of a man who is about to say something unkind and wants an audience for it. Must be something, having a wife who can't pull her own weight. What's she good for exactly? Reading bedtime stories? Samuel had gone very still beside the wagon wheel. Ethan set down the bag of feed he was carrying. He set it down slowly, which was a thing he did when he needed a moment because his father had taught him that the moment before you speak is the one that determines what kind of man you are. "She manages the household accounts," he said. "She's teaching my children, and I'll tell you, Samuel's geography has improved more in 5 weeks with her than it did in the previous year at the schoolhouse. She runs the kitchen without complaint, and she does it well." He picked the feed bag back up. "She earns her place, which is more than I can say for some people I could name." Roy's jaw tightened. "I'm just saying what everyone's saying, Ethan. It's not practical. You need a real partner out here. You need someone who can "I need you to get out of my way," Ethan said. "I've got work to get back to." Roy moved. He didn't look happy about it, but he moved. On the ride home, Samuel was quiet for a long time, which was unusual for Samuel. Then he said, "She does know a lot of geography." "She does," Ethan agreed. "Roy Engel is stupid," Samuel said, with the calm certainty of a child who has arrived at a considered verdict. "Roy Engel is small-minded," Ethan said, "which is worse, but it's different." Samuel thought about this distinction. Then he nodded, slowly, like a judge confirming a ruling. They didn't mention it again. Ethan didn't tell Clara about it when they got home. He told himself that was because it would only upset her, and there was nothing productive in that. But later, lying awake, he thought it was something more complicated. He didn't want to bring the town's opinion of her into the house. He wanted the house to be separate from that. He hadn't known he wanted that until he was trying to figure out why he'd stayed quiet. November got harder, the way November in Montana always did. The temperatures dropped fast, and the wind off the open plain had teeth, and the mornings were dark longer, and the evenings came earlier, and the whole world seemed to compress into the radius of the lamp. The ranch work didn't slow for the weather. It never did. And Ethan was up before light most mornings and in bed near exhaustion most nights, and the middle hours of the day were a blur of cold and physical effort and 100 small decisions about a property that never stopped needing things from him. Clara took on more. He noticed it happening, the incremental way she extended her reach. She was doing the accounts that had been established early on, but now she was also ordering supplies, which meant she'd been paying attention to what he was running low on and when. She had rearranged the supply room, working with Samuel's help on a Saturday morning, so that things were easier to find, and she had not asked him before doing it or announced it after, just done it. And he'd noticed on Monday when he went for the extra rope and found it exactly where it made sense. She was mending things, clothes that had accumulated small tears over months of him not having the time or inclination to deal with them, and she did this in the evenings at the kitchen table while Samuel did his figures and Nora read, the four of them occupying the same space in something that, if he let himself think about it honestly, felt like a household. He was trying not to think about it honestly. One evening in the middle of November, the children had gone to bed, and he was at the kitchen table with the land deed and some figures he was trying to reconcile, and Clara was across from him with the household ledger, working through the month's accounts. It was late enough that the fire had burned down, and neither of them had gotten up to add to it, and the kitchen had that particular cold that came in through the walls when the temperature outside dropped below a certain point. He heard her make a sound. Small, frustrated. The sound of a number that didn't come out right. "Problem?" he said without looking up. "The feed costs from October," she said. "I have 2 different figures. I can't tell which one is right." October feed was $2.40. "I remember because it was higher than September." "Then this one's wrong." She made a small notation. "I'll need the October invoice. Is it in the supply room?" "Probably in the stack on the right side of the shelf, 3rd or 4th from the top." She made another notation and closed the ledger. He heard her starting to put things away, the small sounds of things being organized, and he kept working on his figures, and the kitchen was very quiet. "Ethan," she said. He looked up. She was looking at him with a level directness that he'd come to recognize as her particular way of being serious. No build-up, no softening, just the thing itself. "I need to tell you something. I should have said it before I came. I almost put it in the second letter and then I didn't, and I've been working out how to say it since I got here." He set down his pencil. "The name I used in my letters," she said. "Clara." He was very still. "That's my sister's name," she said. "My name is Evelyn. Evelyn Dorset. Clara she's real? She exists? She's 8 years younger than me, and she lives in Richmond, and she would be horrified to know I used her name, but she'd also understand, probably, because she knows why I did it." He didn't say anything. He was watching her face, which was doing the composed thing, the steady thing, but there was something underneath it that was taking effort to hold in place. "My father was a judge," she said, "a significant one. He made enemies the way powerful men do, not because they're bad necessarily, but because their work requires decisions that not everyone accepts. There were people who wanted to hurt him by hurting his family. We knew that. We lived carefully." She paused. "One night, when I was 24, those people came to our house. My sister was home, Clara, the real one, and I got her out of the room before they reached us. There was a balcony." She stopped again, a longer stop, and he understood that this was the part that cost something. "I fell. I don't remember much about the fall itself. I remember the before, and I remember waking up afterward, and in between there's nothing." The fire popped once in the grate. "After that," she said, "I became a different category. I was not a woman anymore, to most people. I was an unfortunate situation, something to be managed. People who had known me my whole life started speaking to me in a particular voice, slower, softer, simpler, as though my legs and my mind were the same thing." Her jaw shifted briefly. "I stopped being a person they talked to. I became a thing they talked about." "So you used her name," Ethan said. "So I used her name. And I found your advertisement, which asked for someone practical and honest who was good with children, and it didn't say anything about what a woman had to look like or how she had to move through the world. And I thought," she paused, "I thought if I could get to Montana before they made up their minds about me, maybe I'd have a chance to be seen first, before the chair, just for a little while." He looked at her across the kitchen table, in the low light, with the cold coming in through the walls. He thought about the platform on the day she arrived and the look on her face in the second before she composed it. He thought about the notebook and the name at the top of the page and the fact that he'd gone back to read it and the fact that he hadn't told her he had. "I already knew," he said. She went very still. "I saw the notebook," he said, "a few weeks ago. I came in for wire and it was open. I only saw a line or two. I shouldn't have looked at all, and I'm not proud of it." He kept his eyes on her. "I've been waiting for you to tell me." A complicated thing moved across her face. Not quite anger, or maybe a little anger, but other things in with it. She looked down at the closed ledger, and then back at him. "How long?" she said. 4 weeks about? And you didn't say anything?" "No." "Why not?" He thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because I didn't want you to think I was going to use it as a reason to change things," he said. "And because—" He stopped. Started again. "You were going to tell me. I could see you working up to it. I thought it should be your choice when." She looked at him for a long time. He couldn't tell what she was thinking, which was unusual with her. She was generally more readable than she probably intended to be. Finally, she said, "That's either very considerate or very strange." "Maybe both," he said. Something released in her face. Not quite a smile. Her smiles were always smaller than the emotion behind them, but close to it. "My name is Evelyn," she said. "I know," he said. "Do you want me to call you that?" She considered it. "Not yet," she said after a moment. "The town knows Clara. Let it stay Clara for now. But you can know." He nodded. He picked up his pencil. She opened the ledger back up, and they both went back to work. And neither of them said anything else. And the kitchen was quiet in a way that was different from before. The thing with Roy Engel's spread came to a head 2 weeks later. Roy had a cousin visiting from the east, a man named Whitmore, who was, by all available evidence, the kind of person who had never been told no about anything and had decided that made him an authority on the world. He came into town with Roy one afternoon and ended up in the general store at the same time Clara, Evelyn, was there picking up thread and lamp oil. Ethan was not with her. She'd gone into town alone for the first time that week, which had taken some coordinating of the wagon and more stubbornness on her part than he'd been prepared for, and he'd let her go because it was not his place to tell her what she could and couldn't do. He heard about what happened from 3 different people before she got home. The short version was that Whitmore had made a comment loud enough to be heard across the store about the type of man who would marry a cripple when there were real women available. The longer version, which he got from the storekeeper's wife Edna, who had been there and whose opinion of Roy Engel's family was already low, included the fact that Clara, Evelyn, had turned her chair around to face him directly and said, in a voice that did not waver, that she didn't believe his opinion had been requested, and that if Roy Engel's judgment was what vouched for him, he'd arrived in Montana already discredited. Whitmore had said something else. Edna didn't repeat it exactly, just said it was ugly, and that Clara had not responded to that one, had simply turned back to the counter and finished her transaction and left, and that her back had been straight the entire time. When she got home, Ethan was in the yard. He helped her with the wagon without saying anything, and then he said, "I heard." "I thought you might," she said. "Small town. Are you all right?" She was quiet for a moment, which with her meant she was deciding whether to answer honestly or correctly. Then she said, "It's not the first time. It won't be the last." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him. "No," she said. "I'm not all right. I'm angry. I've been angry for 4 years, and I'll probably be angry for the rest of my life about some of it. And I've learned to put it somewhere useful, but today—" She stopped. "Today I'm just angry." "That's fair," he said. She nodded once, sharp, and went inside, and he stood in the yard for a moment with the cold air on his face and something in his chest that had been there for a while now, and that he was getting less successful at ignoring. That night, after supper, Samuel asked if he could show Clara. She was still Clara to the children, still Clara to the whole arrangement. He didn't know if that would ever change, something he'd been working on. He'd drawn a map, his own map from memory, of the territories they'd studied, and it was rough and some of the proportions were badly off. But the names were right, and he'd included things she'd told him, small details about elevation and rivers that the official map didn't make obvious. She looked at it for a long time. "Samuel," she said. "I know it's not right," he said quickly, defensive before she'd said anything critical. "The upper territories are too wide, I think, and I couldn't remember—" "The upper territories are slightly too wide," she agreed. "But you've got the river systems better than most adult maps I've seen. And you remembered the Blackfoot territory boundary, which the schoolhouse map doesn't even include." She looked up at him. "How long did this take you?" He shrugged, which meant it had taken a while and he didn't want to say. "A few evenings." "It's good work," she said. Not effusive, not the cooing that adults sometimes did with children to encourage them, just the plain statement said like she meant it, which was more convincing than any amount of praise. Samuel stood up slightly straighter. Nora, from her corner, said, "He worked on it every night for a week and made me promise not to tell." "Nora," Samuel said, outraged. "She should know how hard you worked," Nora said, unrepentant. "It matters." There was a brief silence, and then Clara said, "She's right, you know, it does matter." And she looked between the two of them, this steady, warm look that she rarely let fully onto her face, and said, "You're both good at looking out for each other." Nora looked down at her book. Samuel sat back down. But neither of them argued, and the kitchen settled back into its particular evening quiet, and Ethan, watching from the doorway he'd been standing in for the last several minutes, thought about what his neighbor Roy Engel had said about burden and suitability and real partnership, and found that he couldn't make those words sit in the same room as what he was watching. He didn't say that. He poured himself coffee and sat down and let the evening be what it was. But late that night, after everyone was asleep and the house was still, he sat at the kitchen table with nothing in front of him and thought about a woman who had fallen from a balcony protecting her sister and had been made to feel like less than she was ever since, who had borrowed a name and crossed half a continent on the chance that someone might see past the chair to the person in it, and who had, in 5 weeks, put his ledger in order and taught his son to care about geography and given his daughter a reason to read again. He sat with that for a while. Then he went to bed because the morning came early and there was always work. And he was a practical man, and he had learned, was still learning, that being practical and being honest with yourself about what mattered were not the same thing, and that the distance between them was something he was going to have to cross eventually. He just wasn't sure he was ready yet, and he suspected, though she'd never said it, that she wasn't either. The letter came on a Wednesday, which was the day the eastbound mail rider passed through Hollow Creek on his way back from the mountain routes. Ethan usually collected the mail himself when he went into town, but that Wednesday, Samuel had gone with Ruth Hadley's boy to the schoolhouse for a recitation event, and Nora had a cough she was pretending wasn't as bad as it was, and Ethan had stayed close to the ranch. The mail rider left the envelope with the postmaster, and the postmaster, who knew everyone's business and considered this a civic responsibility rather than a character flaw, sent his boy out to the Callaway Ranch with it before noon because he had seen the return address and decided it was the kind of thing that shouldn't wait. The envelope was addressed to Clara Dorset, care of the Callaway Ranch, Hollow Creek, Montana Territory. The return address was a law office in Richmond, Virginia. Ethan took it from the postmaster's boy and thanked him and stood in the yard holding it for a moment before he went inside. Evelyn was at the kitchen table with Nora, both of them bent over a slate. Nora had been working on her figures, which she found less interesting than reading, but had been improving it steadily since Evelyn started making the problems about things Nora actually cared about. How many books fit on a shelf of a given length? How many days until spring if you counted from the first frost? She looked up when Ethan came in. Evelyn did not, immediately, finishing something she was writing on the slate's edge. "Mail came," Ethan said. She looked up then. He set the envelope on the table without comment. He watched her see the return address, watched something cross her face that was quick and controlled and gone almost before it registered, the reflex of someone who has learned to lock down their first reactions in public. Her hand came to rest on the envelope but didn't open it. "Nora," she said, "why don't you go check on the water in the back bucket? I think it may have frozen overnight." Nora looked at her, then at the envelope, then at her father, and stood up without argument, which told Ethan she had understood something was happening and had decided to respect it, which was a Nora response and not a Samuel response, and which, despite the circumstances, made him quietly proud. When Nora was gone, Evelyn opened the envelope. She read it the way she read most things, focused, still, her eyes moving steadily down the page. He could not see her face from where he was standing. He moved to put the kettle on because it was something to do, and because standing there watching her felt wrong. He heard the paper settle on the table. "My father is dead," she said. He turned around. She was looking at the letter, not at him. Her face was doing the composed thing, but there were lines in it he hadn't seen before, a tightening around the eyes and jaw that was not about composure. It was what composure was being stretched over. "I'm sorry," he said, and meant it without ornamentation. "He's been ill for some time. I knew it was coming." She paused. "That doesn't make it different." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There's more." She didn't pick the letter back up. She'd read it once, and apparently that had been enough to hold the whole thing. "When my father died, his affairs became a matter of public record. His name, his cases, his family. The law office is informing me that people who were involved in the case that caused my injury have become aware of my location." The kettle was starting to heat. He left it. "Became aware how?" he said. "My father used my real name in his will," she said, "Evelyn Dorset, and the territory, and—" She stopped, started again more carefully. It would not be difficult for someone who was looking to find a mail-order bride by that name who came to Montana this autumn. He thought about that. "Who are these people?" "A man named Garrett Voss," she said. "He was one of my father's prosecutors. He had a business partner who went to prison on my father's ruling. He blamed my father. He blamed our family." She looked up then, and her eyes were steady but tired in a way that went past one afternoon. "The night of the accident, the balcony, Voss was the one who sent those men. My father could never prove it, but he knew. I knew." Ethan pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. And now Voss knows where you are. The letter says he may, she said. That's the lawyers being careful. What they mean is that he does. Outside, he could hear Nora at the back of the house, doing the thing with the bucket with more thoroughness than was strictly necessary, giving them time. The kettle was beginning to make noise. How dangerous is he? Ethan said. She looked at him directly. He sent men to a judge's house, she said. He was willing to hurt a woman and her daughter to make a point. She paused. Dangerous enough. He got up and took the kettle off before it screamed. He poured 2 cups, more to have something in his hands than because he wanted coffee. He set one in front of her. She didn't touch it. I'll understand, she said, if this changes things. He looked at her. The arrangement, she said. I brought this with me. I didn't know I was bringing it, but Evelyn, he said, which was the first time he'd said her name out loud, and he saw it register on her face. Stop. She stopped. You're not going anywhere, he said. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully interpret, something that was working very hard against something else. You don't know what you're agreeing to. I know what I'm saying no to, he said. That's enough for right now. She looked down at the coffee cup, and he saw her throat move, and then she picked it up and wrapped both hands around it and didn't say anything more, which was its own kind of answer. He went into town that afternoon. He didn't tell her he was going to see the sheriff because he didn't want her to feel managed, and he didn't want to have a conversation about whether it was necessary because he'd already decided it was. Tom Briggs had been sheriff in Hollow Creek for 11 years and was a careful, unsentimental man who Ethan respected precisely because he didn't overclaim. He said what he knew and nothing beyond it. Ethan told him the situation, not all of it, but enough. A man with a grievance who knew where Evelyn was, a history of violence, a law office in Richmond advising caution. Tom Briggs listened without interrupting. Then he said, You got a name? Garrett Voss. Tom wrote it down. I'll send a wire to the Richmond office. Find out if there's anything on record. He looked at Ethan. And in the meantime, you keep your eyes open. That was already the plan, Ethan said. He rode home through the long way, which took him around the western edge of the property along the creek line. Not because it was faster, but because it let him see the approach to the ranch from several angles, and he noted where the visibility was good and where it wasn't, and he thought about things he hadn't needed to think about in years. He told Ruth Hadley. He wasn't sure afterward whether that had been the right call, but Ruth knew the town in ways he didn't, and if there was a stranger asking questions anywhere within 20 miles of Hollow Creek, Ruth would hear about it before Tom Briggs would. He told her only what was essential, and she listened with her arms crossed and her face doing the thing it did when she was taking something seriously. And she doesn't know you've told me, Ruth said. No. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, She's going to be irritated about that. Probably. But you're right to do it. She uncrossed her arms. You know, I haven't been... She stopped and started again in a different direction, which was unusual for Ruth. I've not been fair to her. He waited. When she came, Ruth said, I was the one who pushed you toward the advertisement, and then when she arrived, She pressed her lips together. I didn't expect her to be what she is. I had an idea in my head about what you needed, and she didn't match it, and I decided that meant she was wrong for the situation rather than that my idea was wrong. She met his eyes. She's good with those children, Ethan. Yes, he said. She is. Nora came out of herself, Ruth said, and there was something genuine in it, something that cost a little. I've been trying to get that child to talk to me for 2 years. He didn't say anything to that because it wasn't his to comment on. I'll keep my ears open, Ruth said. If anyone comes through asking about a judge's daughter or a woman in a chair, I'll know before noon. The town meeting happened on the first Friday of December. It was not officially called as a town meeting. It was announced as a general gathering at the Hollow Creek Community Hall to discuss winter preparedness, which was a legitimate topic and one that warranted discussion, but Ethan knew from the way Roy Engel looked at him outside the feed store that morning. That winter preparedness was not the primary item on the agenda. He went anyway, because not going would have meant ceding ground he hadn't agreed to cede. Evelyn did not come. They had not discussed it, which was its own discussion. She had known about the meeting. It was a small town, and she had said nothing about it, and he had said nothing about it, and on Friday evening he'd saddled the horse and gone into town, and she had been at the kitchen table with the ledger and had not looked up when he left, which might have meant she was fine with it, or might have meant she'd decided to let it go, and he couldn't always tell the difference with her. The community hall was full. That was the first thing he registered. There were more people than he'd expected, which meant this had been more deliberately organized than the announcement had suggested. He found a spot near the back wall and stayed standing. Mayor Aldrich opened things with a genuine discussion of winter stores and the state of the road to the mountain pass, and for a while Ethan thought he might have misread the whole situation. Then Roy Engel stood up. Roy was not a bad man exactly. Ethan had known him for 6 years, and they'd helped each other more than once, a borrowed tool, a hand with a difficult berth in the cattle. Roy was a man who believed things strongly and didn't examine them closely enough, and that particular combination of traits made him feel righteous when he was actually only certain. "I think we ought to talk about the Calloway situation," Roy said. There was a shift in the room, a settling, the kind that told Ethan a fair number of people had been waiting for exactly this. Mayor Aldrich looked pained. "Roy, it's a community matter," Roy said. "Ethan's a part of this community. What happens on his ranch affects the rest of us." "What happens on my ranch," Ethan said from the back wall, "is my business." Heads turned. Roy turned. "Nobody's saying it isn't," Roy said, in the tone of someone who is about to say exactly that. "But people are concerned. A man in your situation, 2 children, a ranch that's struggling. You need real help out there, Ethan, not—" He paused, and in the pause, Ethan could see him choosing the word. "Not a charity case." The room was quiet. "Say what you mean, Roy," Ethan said. "I mean the woman can't function on a working ranch. We all know it. Everyone in this room knows it. She can't ride, she can't work the land, she can't do half of what needs doing. She does the accounts," said Edna Marsh, the storekeeper's wife, from the middle of the room. Ethan had not expected that. "I've talked to her about the supply orders. She knows her numbers better than most men in this room." Roy glanced at Edna, recalibrated. "I'm not saying she's not clever. She's teaching those children," said someone else, a voice Ethan didn't immediately place. "My boy said Samuel Calloway has been talking about geography at the schoolhouse. Things even the teacher doesn't know." "That's not—" Roy was losing the thread of it, visibly. "I'm not talking about school teaching. I'm talking about a man who needs a real partner, and instead he's taken on someone who suits his family," Ethan said. He moved away from the back wall. Not aggressively. He kept his voice level, because he'd found that level was more effective than loud in a room like this. "She teaches my children. She keeps my house. She manages the household accounts better than I ever have. My daughter, who has barely spoken in 2 years, reads again. She talks again. You want to tell me that doesn't count as contributing to my ranch? Ethan, my son can name every territory in this country and tell you the watershed of each one. He knows things I didn't know at his age. And my daughter, Nora, who you've all known since she was born, who you watched go quiet after her mother died. Nora laughed in my kitchen last week, laughed out loud at something Clara told her." His throat was tight. He hadn't planned this, and it was getting away from him slightly, but he was committed now. "When was the last time you heard that child laugh?" The room was very still. "She's not what any of you expected," he said. "She's not what I expected, if I'm honest about it. But she showed up here and she worked every day without asking to be excused from anything, without complaining about what she couldn't do. And she did what she could do better than most people I know who have no limitations at all." He looked at Roy, and Roy was looking at the floor. "The woman you're calling a burden is the same woman who pulled my family back towards something that looks like a family. You want to call that a charity case? You go ahead. But don't do it in front of me." Nobody said anything. Mayor Aldrich, after a moment, said, "Perhaps we ought to move on to the road conditions." They moved on to the road conditions. He didn't tell Evelyn about any of it that night. He wasn't sure why, except that telling her would require her to respond, and he wasn't sure he wanted to navigate what she'd do with the information. She'd likely say she didn't need him to defend her, which was true, and also beside the point. and they'd end up in a conversation about independence and obligation that he didn't have the energy for at 11 o'clock on a cold Friday night. What he did do was sit down at the kitchen table after checking on the children and find her still there, the ledger closed now, her hands around an empty cup, just sitting. "How was the meeting?" she said. "Routine," he said. She looked at him with the look she used when she knew he was being incomplete but had decided not to push. "All right," she said. "Evelyn?" She looked up. "Does the room work for you?" he said. "The East Room, is it? Do you have what you need in there?" She was quiet for a moment, clearly recalibrating. This was not what she'd expected him to say. "It's fine," she said, "because I was thinking we could move the writing desk to a better position, closer to the window. The morning light you'd get." "Ethan." Her voice was not unkind. "What happened at the meeting?" He looked at her. He thought about Roy Engel and the room going still, and Edna Marsh speaking up from the middle of it unexpectedly, and Mayor Aldrich's pained face, and the sound of his own voice getting away from him. "Nothing I couldn't handle," he said. She held his gaze for a long moment, then she said quietly, "Thank you." He didn't ask how she knew. She'd grown up the daughter of a judge, in a household where the texture of what people didn't say was as important as what they did, and she read rooms the way she read her ledger, carefully, precisely, without needing every figure to be spelled out. "The desk," she said. "You're probably right about the position. I'll move it Saturday," he said. "I can help." "I know you can," he said, "but I'll move it." She almost smiled. Almost. The stranger arrived on a Tuesday, 12 days after the letter from the Richmond lawyers. Ethan didn't know he was a stranger at first. Hollow Creek got travelers through, not often but regularly, men passing between territories, salesmen, the occasional land surveyor. A man riding in on a good horse and stopping at the hotel was not remarkable. What made Tom Briggs come out to the ranch 2 days later was not the man himself, but the questions he'd been asking. Quiet questions, the kind designed not to be noticed, directed at the right people to seem innocent. The hotel keeper, the postmaster's boy. Roy Engel, who had talked without knowing what he was giving away. Tom sat across from Ethan at the kitchen table, hat in hand, with Evelyn beside Ethan and both children sent out to the barn. "His name isn't known," Tom said, but his questions were about a woman who came in on the October westbound, specifically about whether she was still here, who she lived with, how far out from town the ranch was. Evelyn was very still. "He left yesterday morning," Tom said, which either means he got what he wanted and went back to report, or he got what he wanted and is handling it himself. "How long do we have?" Ethan said. "I don't know. If he went to send a wire to whoever sent him, maybe a week. If he didn't..." Tom glanced at Evelyn. "I want to be straight with you. I don't know enough about who's behind this to tell you what they'd be willing to do." "Garrett Voss," Evelyn said. It was the first thing she'd said. Tom wrote it down, same as Ethan had given him the name a week ago. "I'll send another wire to Richmond, but I'd feel better if you both understood that, until I know more, you should be careful about your routines. Who knows when you're in town, what roads you take?" After Tom left, the kitchen was quiet for a long time. Nora and Samuel came in from the barn eventually, tracking mud and smelling of horse, and the ordinary machinery of the afternoon started up around them. Ethan watched Evelyn move through it, getting supper started, answering Samuel's questions about whether soup counted as a real supper or just a practice one, straightening the stack of books on the corner shelf that had gotten tilted. And she did all of it without showing anything, without letting it land on the children the way it was landing on her. He knew it was landing on her because that evening, after supper, after the children were in bed, she sat at the kitchen table and did not open the ledger. She just sat. The notebook was in front of her, but she didn't open that either. "Evelyn," he said. "I know," she said, without looking up. "I brought this here, I know that." "Stop," he said. "I should have been more—" "Stop," he said, more firmly. "You protected your sister. You had an accident. You tried to build a life for yourself the only way you could figure out how to do it. None of that is something you're responsible for apologizing about." She looked up then. Her eyes were dry, but barely. "This is your home," she said. "Your children." "Yes," he said. "And you're in it." He said it plainly, like a fact, like the ledger figures they balanced together on Tuesday nights. So we figure out what comes next. Together. She looked at him for a long moment. He could see her working through it, the same way she worked through a column of figures that didn't quite balance, methodically, without flinching. "All right," she said. It came out quieter than she probably intended. He nodded once. He got up and refilled both their cups and sat back down, and she opened the ledger after all. And outside the Montana night settled in around the ranch, cold and vast and indifferent, the way frontier nights were. But inside the lamp was burning, and the figures on the page were being reconciled one by one, and across the table from him sat a woman who had borrowed her sister's name and crossed half a continent and fallen from more than one kind of height, and landed, improbably, here, in his home, in his ledger, in the unarticulated accounting of what this life had become. He didn't say any of that. He wasn't built for saying things like that, and she would have been suspicious of him if he had been. But he sat there, across from her, in the quiet house, and he did not go to bed, and neither did she. And the lamp burned until nearly midnight, and that was its own kind of answer to the question neither of them had yet found the right words to ask. Tom Briggs came back on Thursday with the reply from Richmond, and it was worse than Ethan had hoped and better than he'd feared, which was the particular mathematics of bad news that left you uncertain how to feel about it. The wire confirmed that Garrett Voss was a man of means and a man of patience, which was a more dangerous combination than either quality alone. He had waited 4 years. 4 years since the night of the balcony, since the imprisonment of his business partner, since Judge Dorset had made his ruling and Voss had decided that justice and revenge were two words for the same thing. He had not acted impulsively in all that time. He had built, methodically, toward a moment when he could act without being the obvious hand behind it. The Richmond office says there are 2 open complaints against him, Tom told them, again at the kitchen table, again with the children outside. Ethan had asked Roy Engel's boy to take Samuel and Nora into town for the afternoon, which Roy had agreed to with a guilty efficiency that told Ethan the man was still sitting with what had happened at the community meeting. Both complaints are from people connected to Judge Dorset's cases. Both involve intimidation. No charges ever stuck. "Because he's careful," Evelyn said. "Because he's careful," Tom agreed. "The man he sent here, we think his name is Prentice, based on a description the hotel keeper gave. Prentice is not someone Voss would use if he planned to be subtle about what comes next. Prentice has a history." "Of what?" Ethan said. Tom looked at him steadily. "Violence," he said. "Applied to order." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "So he's not coming to talk," Ethan said. "No," Tom said. "I don't believe he is," Ethan said. "No," Tom said. "I don't believe he is." Evelyn had her hands flat on the table. It was a thing she did when she was keeping herself from doing something else with them, and Ethan had learned to read it. He kept his eyes on Tom. "What can you do?" he said. "I can deputize a couple of men and increase presence on the roads into town. I can keep the wire open to Richmond in case there's more coming." Tom paused. "What I can't do is station someone at your property indefinitely. I don't have the men for it." "I'm not asking for that," Ethan said. "I know you're not." Tom put his hat on. "I'm telling you what I can't do so you know what you're working with." He looked at Evelyn, directly, with the plain respect of a man who addressed people as they were, rather than as he wished they were. "I'm sorry you're in this, Miss Dorset. I mean that." She nodded once. "I know." After Tom left, neither of them spoke for a while. The clock on the kitchen wall worked through its ticking, and somewhere outside a horse shifted in the paddock, and the wind came and went along the eaves. "This is Prentice," Evelyn said eventually. "Not Voss." "Yes. Voss won't come himself. He never does." She said it with the flat certainty of someone who had thought about a person for 4 years. "He sends people. He watches results. He waits." "What does Prentice want exactly? Is it—" Ethan chose the word carefully. "Is it you, specifically?" She looked at the table. "Voss wants to close the account," she said. "My father is dead. The ruling stands, Kian. He can't undo it, but he wants the last word on what the ruling cost." She paused. "He wants me to be afraid. He wants me to run. Or worse, he wants me to simply disappear so that the Dorset name is finished." "He's not going to get any of those things," Ethan said. She looked at him. "Ethan, he's not," Ethan said. So we figure out how to make sure of that, Chad. He went to see Roy Engel the next morning, which was not a thing he had planned to do and which required him to set down a certain amount of pride at the gate before he rode in. Roy was in his barn, which was a better barn than Ethan's barn, better maintained and better stocked, because Roy had the advantage of 2 adult sons who worked the spread alongside him and hadn't spent the last 2 years managing grief and 2 children on his own. Roy saw him coming and set down what he was doing and didn't say anything while Ethan dismounted, which was Roy's version of courtesy. "I need to tell you something," Ethan said, "and then I need to ask you something, and you can say no to the second part." Roy folded his arms. "All right." Ethan told him. Not everything. Not Evelyn's full history, not the name she'd been born with, those weren't his to share. But enough. A man with a grievance against her family. A hired hand already through town asking questions. Tom Briggs aware but limited in what he could do. Roy listened without interrupting. His face moved through several things: discomfort, something that might have been guilt, and then the settling into seriousness that happened when Roy Engel decided a thing was real and not just talk. "What are you asking?" Roy said. "If something happens and I need to get the children somewhere safe fast, I need to know there's somewhere to bring them." Ethan kept his eyes on Roy. "Your place is the nearest." Roy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You bring those kids here any time, day or night. You don't even have to knock." Ethan nodded. "Thank you." Roy uncrossed his arms. He looked at the barn floor for a moment. "That thing I said at the meeting," he said, "about the charity case." "Don't," Ethan said. "Ethan, I need your barn as a safe place for my children. I don't need an apology right now. Save it for when this is over." He picked up his reins. "But I'll take it then." Roy almost smiled. Almost. Fair enough. The waiting was the hardest part. 3 days passed, and then 4, and nothing happened. Prentice, if that was the man, did not reappear in town. No one reported a stranger on the roads. The ranch went through its routines, morning and evening, and the long working hours between, and on the surface nothing had changed. But underneath, everything had. Ethan moved differently around the property. He'd always been alert. Frontier life required a certain baseline awareness. But now there was a layer beneath that, a specific quality of watchfulness that exhausted him in a way physical work didn't. He checked the perimeter of the property morning and night. He positioned himself, without announcing it, between the house and whatever approach was least visible. He told himself it was practical. It was practical. But it also sat on him in a way he felt in his shoulders by the end of each day. Evelyn noticed. He knew she noticed because she stopped asking him to come in for coffee at mid-morning, which she'd started doing 3 weeks earlier because he forgot to eat when he was working, and she had figured out without being told that this was a regular problem. She stopped asking not because she was angry, but because she understood what he was doing and she was letting him do it without the friction of normality layered over it. It was a small consideration, the kind that had no name and required no acknowledgement, and he noticed it the way he noticed most of what she did, sideways, without looking directly. Samuel knew something was wrong in the way children know things, not the particulars, but the weather of it. He was quieter than usual, and he stuck close to the house, and twice Ethan caught him standing in the yard looking out at the road with an expression that was too old for his face. Nora didn't show it at all, which was worse. Nora internalized. He'd known that since she was 5 years old. On the 5th night, after supper, he heard Evelyn and Nora in the east room. He wasn't trying to listen. He was passing the hallway on his way to check the front door latch, which had been sticking, but the door was partly open and Nora's voice carried. "Are you scared?" Nora said. A pause. "Sometimes," Evelyn said. "What do you do when you're scared?" Another pause, longer. "I find the next thing I can actually do something about. And I do that thing." A beat. "Being scared doesn't go away because you ignore it, but it gets smaller when you're busy with something real." Silence. "Mama used to say something like that," Nora said. "Different words." "She sounded like a smart woman," Evelyn said. "She was." Nora's voice was quiet. "You're smart too. Different kind of smart." Ethan moved away from the hallway before he heard anything else because that conversation belonged to them and not to him. and because something in his chest had done something that he needed a moment alone with. Prentice came back on a Sunday. He didn't come to the ranch. He went to the church in town, which most of Hollow Creek attended on Sunday morning, and he sat in the back and waited, and when people filed out, he was standing by the door and he was watching. Watching for who was absent, watching for who might know where the Calloway Ranch was, and could be made to say so without understanding why they were being asked. He found the postmaster's son, who was 17 and friendly and had no reason to be suspicious of a polite stranger with a decent horse and a Virginia accent. The boy told him the road. He told him the landmark, the split oak on the west side of the creek crossing, and approximately how far past it the ranch house sat. Tom Briggs found out about this at noon from the postmaster himself, who had seen the conversation from across the street and had the instinct that something was off. Tom rode out to the Calloway Ranch immediately. Ethan was in the yard when Tom's horse came fast up the road, and he knew from the speed of it before Tom pulled up. "He was in town this morning," Tom said, barely dismounted. "He knows where you are. He knows the road." Ethan's mind went to the children first, always the children first. "Samuel and Nora, get them to Roy's," Tom said. "Now, Ethan, don't wait." He went inside. He didn't explain in full. There wasn't time for full. But he told them to put their boots on and get their coats, and something in his voice made both children move without argument, even Samuel, who always had a question about everything. Evelyn was already at the kitchen table, her coat across her lap, the green notebook in her suitcase. She'd understood from Tom's voice at the door. "I'm coming with you," she said. "You're going to Roy's with the children," he said. "Ethan." "Evelyn." He stopped in front of her and looked at her directly, not harshly, just clearly. "I need to know where you all are. I need to know you're together, and I know where together is. That's what I need right now." She looked at him for a moment. Her jaw was tight. "And what are you going to do?" "Make sure he comes to me instead of looking for you." She stared at him. "That's not a plan. That's a decision to be a target." "That's what I've got," he said honestly. She made a sound that was not quite a word, low and frustrated, and then she picked up her coat and put it on and said, "If you get yourself killed being heroic, I will be extremely angry." "I'll keep that in mind," he said. He got them to Roy's in the wagon, Tom riding alongside. Roy came out before they'd fully stopped, because Roy had been waiting since Friday, and he got Samuel and Nora inside with a speed and competence that Ethan was grateful for. Evelyn transferred from the wagon to the porch with Roy's help, and without asking for Ethan's, and then she turned and looked at him from the porch, and he looked at her from the wagon. "Be careful," she said. It came out flat and direct, no sentimentality in it, which was how she said things she meant the most. "Yes," he said. He did not say anything else because he wasn't sure he trusted what else might come out, and there wasn't time. And some things could wait until after. He turned the wagon and headed back toward the ranch. His plan, such as it was built on what he knew about men like Prentice. They were professionals in the specific sense that they preferred their work to be clean, to arrive, accomplish the task, leave before it could be traced back. A man like Prentice would not want an audience. He would not want to arrive at a ranch and find a sheriff's deputy waiting. He would not want complications. So Ethan made complications. He sent a rider, Roy's older son James, back to town to tell Tom where he was going and what he was doing. He wrote a short note to be wired to the Richmond law office, giving them Prentice's description and stating that the man was on Calloway property in Montana territory. He did not know if either of those things would matter in the next few hours, but he sent them anyway because in the absence of a good plan, you executed the pieces of a plan you had. Then he went to the ranch. He went in the back way through the creek crossing, leaving the horse tied in the cottonwood stand east of the barn. The afternoon light was low and gray, the particular flat light of a December afternoon in Montana when the clouds came in from the north and the whole sky turned the color of old pewter. He moved through the property on foot, staying close to the structures, and the cold was sharp in his lungs and his breath made small clouds that he was aware of and couldn't do anything about. He checked the barn first. Empty. The supply room off the kitchen, which had an exterior door. Empty. The root cellar. Empty. He came back around to the front of the house, and he was reaching for the porch latch when he heard the horse. Not his horse. He'd left that across the creek. This was a horse on the main road, coming at a measured pace, not hurrying, which was the pace of a man who didn't think anyone was home and was approaching to confirm it. Ethan went inside through the back. He took the rifle from the rack above the kitchen door, an old repeating rifle he'd owned for 12 years and knew well, and he moved to the front window and looked out through the gap in the curtain. The rider had come off the main road and was on the property approach, and he was exactly what Tom's description had suggested. A compact man, well-dressed for travel, on a good horse, with the particular stillness of someone who was watching everything and showing nothing. Prentice stopped 20 yards from the house and looked at the front of it for a long moment. Then he called out, "Calloway." Ethan didn't answer. "I know you're in there. Your horse is gone, but the lamp's been burning." He paused. "I'm not here for you. I don't have any interest in you. I'm here for the woman." Ethan looked at the lamp on the kitchen table, which he'd left burning without thinking about it. He made a note, somewhere in the back of his mind, to think about those things more carefully in the future. "She's not here," he said, through the front window, not showing himself. A pause. "I figured that when I saw the wagon tracks heading north. Roy Engel's place, I expect." Another pause. "I'll find her eventually. You understand that. This can go clean or it can go complicated. The choice is yours." "Tell Voss," Ethan said, "that his business with the Dorset family is finished. The judge is dead. Whatever account he thinks is open, it's closed. There's nothing left to collect." "That's not my decision," Prentice said. He said it reasonably, which was somehow more unsettling than anger would have been. "I follow instructions." "Then follow them somewhere else," Ethan said. Prentice was quiet for a moment. The horse shifted under him. "I'd like to do this without unnecessary trouble," he said. "I'm asking you one more time to step out and have a direct conversation, man to man." Ethan thought about that. He thought about Evelyn on Roy Engel's porch, her voice flat and straight. "Be careful." He thought about what kind of man Prentice was, and whether a conversation, man to man, was actually what was being offered. He decided it wasn't. "I've got a rifle, and I know how to use it," Ethan said. "I've got a wire going to Richmond right now with your description and your location. I've got Tom Briggs who will be here within the hour. You want to wait around for all of that, you go ahead, or you can turn that horse around." A long silence. "Voss won't let this rest," Prentice said. "That's between Voss and the law," Ethan said. "Get off my property." Another silence, longer. The flat gray light sat on everything. Ethan watched through the curtain gap, and his hands were steady on the rifle, and his heart was doing something loud against his ribs that he was actively refusing to pay attention to. Prentice turned the horse. He rode back down the approach to the main road at the same measured pace he'd arrived, and then he turned south, toward town, and Ethan watched until the man was out of sight, and then watched a while longer, and then he set the rifle against the wall and sat down in the kitchen chair and let out a long, slow breath that felt like it had been in him for a week. His hands were shaking slightly. He noticed that and thought, without much emotion, that shaking afterward was probably the correct response to what had just happened, and he sat there for a few minutes and waited for it to pass. It mostly did. Tom Briggs arrived 30 minutes later with one of his deputies, and Ethan told him what had happened, and Tom sent the deputy south on the road after Prentice, while Tom himself stayed at the ranch and asked questions in the methodical way Tom asked questions, writing things down. "You turned him away," Tom said at the end of it. "For now," Ethan said. "For now," Tom agreed. He looked at his notes. "He'll report back to Voss. Voss may try again, or he may decide the exposure isn't worth it. The wire to Richmond. That was the smart move. If there's a record of this man being here, being connected to Voss, that's leverage. Will it be enough?" Tom looked at him with the honest eyes of a man who didn't overclaim. "I don't know," he said, "but it's more than you had this morning." Teat. He went to Roy's at dusk. The house was lit up, which was a relief. Roy's wife Helen had the kind of instinct that manifested as soup, and Ethan could smell it from the porch, and it struck him, coming up the steps, that he was hungry in a way he hadn't registered all day. Samuel hit him in the midsection approximately 2 seconds after Helen opened the door, both arms around Ethan's waist, the full-body collision of a child who had been scared and was now furious at himself for being scared. Ethan held on. "I'm fine," he said. "I know," Samuel said, muffled against Ethan's coat. "You can let go." "In a minute," Samuel said. He let him have the minute. Nora was at the kitchen table with Roy's youngest, the two of them doing something with a deck of cards. She looked at him when he came in, a long, level look, and then she nodded once, which from Nora meant everything was all right, and she wasn't going to make anything of how scared she'd been, and he nodded back the same way. Evelyn was by the fireplace. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him from the porch that afternoon, assessing, direct, and then she looked at his hands, which were steadier now, and then back at his face. "You're all right," she said. It was not quite a question. "I'm all right." "Prentice?" "Gone south. Tom's deputy is following. He moved to the fire because the cold had gotten into him on the ride over and hadn't left. He may be back. Tom thinks if we've built enough of a record, Voss may decide it's not worth the exposure." "May," she said. "May," he said. She was quiet for a moment. The fire cracked and shifted. "I don't like having been sent away," she said. "I know. I understand why you did it. I don't like it." "Fair," he said. She looked at the fire. "Did you think he'd shoot you?" "It crossed my mind," he said honestly. "And you went anyway." He looked at her. "Yes." She was quiet again. He watched her profile in the firelight, the straight line of her jaw, the way she held her shoulders, the composed surface of her that he had spent months learning to read under rather than across. He thought about the night on his kitchen floor when he'd sat too long after everyone else was asleep, thinking about a woman who had crossed half a continent on the chance that someone would see past the chair to the person in it. He thought she deserved to hear some of what he'd been thinking. "Evelyn," he said. She looked at him. "I'm not good at saying things," he said. I've known for a while that whatever I thought this arrangement was going to be, it isn't that anymore. It hasn't been that for some time." He stopped and tried again. "I'm not keeping you here because of the arrangement. The arrangement doesn't have anything to do with it, actually. What I mean is, Ethan," she said quietly. He stopped. "I know," she said. She said it simply, without performance, the way she said the things she meant most. "I've known for a while." "Then why didn't you—" "Because you needed to say it," she said. "When you were ready." He looked at her. The fire moved between them. Behind them, Samuel had released Roy's youngest from a card game dispute, and Nora was explaining the rules to Helen in her careful, precise way. And Roy was laughing at something in the kitchen doorway, and the house was full of the ordinary, complicated noise of people who were scared and relieved and tired and still here. "I'm not good at this," he said again, because it bore repeating. "I know," she said. And there was something in it that wasn't patience, exactly. It was more specific than that. It was the knowledge of him, gathered over months of kitchen tables and long evenings and ledger figures and the particular shorthand of two people who have been paying careful attention. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. Roy appeared in the doorway. "Are you two going to stand by the fire all night, or are you eating with us?" "We're eating," Ethan said. "Good," Roy said. "Helen made enough soup for most of Montana." He looked at Evelyn, and she looked at him, and then they went to eat because the soup was there, and the children were there, and the night was cold outside, and some things didn't need to be finished to be understood, and they both understood that too. The wound came later that night, on the road home. A thrown shoe on his horse at the creek crossing, the animal stumbling on the ice, Ethan's shoulder catching the frozen bank when he went down hard. It wasn't serious, not the way a bullet wound would have been, but the shoulder was wrenched badly enough that he couldn't lift his right arm past his chest, and by the time he got back to the ranch, walking the horse, leading it slow in the dark, he was moving carefully, and the cold had made the whole thing stiffer than it had started. Evelyn was already home. She'd gone ahead in the wagon with the children. She heard him come in and saw the way he was holding himself and didn't say anything about it, just told him to sit down at the kitchen table, which he did. She got the basin and the linen and the liniment that Margaret had always kept in the top shelf of the supply room cabinet, which Ethan himself had almost thrown out twice in 2 years because looking at it was hard, and which Evelyn had apparently found and kept without asking or commenting. She worked on the shoulder steadily, without fuss, and it hurt in the way these things always hurt, the deep joint ache of something wrenched and now being handled, and he sat with it because that was all you could do with it. "Lean forward," she said. He leaned forward. "It's not dislocated," she said, working the linen around the joint, "but you'll feel it for a week." "I know," he said. "You should have been more careful on the ice." "I know." "This is not the heroic injury you were picturing." "No," he said. "I wasn't picturing any injury." "Nobody ever does," she said. Her hands moved efficiently over the shoulder, binding it the way a person binds something who has some knowledge of how injuries work and how they don't. And the lamp was on the table between them, and the children were in bed, and the house was quiet. And outside, the Montana night lay over everything, cold and enormous and empty the way it was. "Evelyn," he said. "Hold still," she said. He held still. She finished with the shoulder and sat back, and he straightened slowly, rolling it slightly to test the compression, and it was better than it had been. "Thank you," he said. She nodded. She didn't move away immediately. She sat there across from him in the lamplight with her hands folded in her lap and her face doing the not-quite smile that he had memorized without meaning to. "Go to bed," she said. "You're exhausted." "So are you." "Yes," she said up, "but I'll sit here a few more minutes." He understood, without her saying it, that she needed to sit in the kitchen and let the day be over before she could sleep, and that this was a private thing, a way she had of processing what had happened that she did alone. He had his own version of it, though his looked different. He stood up slowly, favoring the shoulder. "Evelyn," he said. She looked up. "We're going to be all right," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, and then she said, "I know." And the way she said it, not hopefully, not with the performed confidence of someone trying to believe something, but simply like a figure that had been checked and confirmed, told him that she meant it. He went to bed. She sat in the kitchen alone, in the lamplight, in the house that had been empty for 2 years and wasn't anymore. And outside the wind moved along the eaves of the ranch that still needed paint and always needed something. And Hollow Creek slept in the cold Montana dark. And whatever came next was going to come. But not tonight. Tonight, everyone was home. The shoulder took 8 days to heal properly, which was 4 more days than Ethan had told Evelyn it would take. And she noted this without comment, which was worse than if she'd said something. He caught her watching him favor it on the 5th day when he thought she wasn't looking, and she looked away without a word, and that small silence carried more observation in it than most people's full sentences. Prentice did not come back. Tom Briggs got a wire from Richmond on the Wednesday after the confrontation, and then another one on Friday, and by the following week, he had enough to sit down with Ethan and Evelyn together and lay out what had developed. Garrett Voss, it appeared, had not anticipated a wire. He had not anticipated a formal record being created, had not anticipated that a rancher in Montana Territory would know to do that. And the combination of Prentice's name appearing in official correspondence connected to Voss's known associates had caused, in the careful language of the Richmond Law Office, a significant recalculation on Voss's part. "They've opened a formal inquiry," Tom said. "Not just the complaints from before. This one has teeth because now there's evidence of coordinated harassment across state lines. Voss's lawyers are apparently advising him to go quiet." "For how long?" Evelyn said. Tom looked at her. "Could be permanent. A man in Voss's position, he's built something, legitimate businesses on top of the other things. An inquiry that goes public costs him more than whatever he thinks he's owed." He paused. "I'm not telling you it's finished. I don't know that. But I'm telling you the calculus changed." Evelyn nodded slowly. She had her hands flat on the table, and then she moved them to her lap, and Ethan watched the particular quality of her stillness shift. Not quite relief, not quite letting go, but something adjacent to both of those things, like a person who has been braced for impact and is only now beginning to believe the thing may not be coming. "The inquiry," she said. "Is my name in it?" "Your real name, yes. It had to be, to establish standing." Tom met her eyes. "I'm sorry. I know that wasn't what you wanted." She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said, "but it's what's true. I'm done hiding my name." She said it plainly, without drama, the way she said things she'd decided and wasn't going to revisit. After Tom left, Ethan said, "Evelyn." She looked at him. "It's going to be all right," he said, which was what he'd said to her 8 days ago in the kitchen with the lamp burning. And she'd said, I know the way she said things she meant. She said it again now, same tone, same steadiness. And this time he believed it a little more than he had then. December finished itself and January came in hard, the way Montana Januaries did, with a cold that was not dramatic about itself, just absolute. The ground froze solid and the creek ran slow under a skin of ice, and the mornings were dark until nearly 8, and the evenings started at 4, and the ranch contracted into itself the way ranches did in deep winter, the world narrowing to the house and the barn and the distance between them. It was in this contraction, this enforced proximity, that things settled. Not smoothly. Nothing about the Callaway Ranch in January was smooth. The stovepipe clogged twice, and the second time required Ethan to get on the roof in temperatures that were genuinely dangerous. And Evelyn stood at the base of the ladder and offered commentary he had not requested about whether this was strictly necessary right now or whether it could wait until afternoon. It could not wait until afternoon, as he explained from the roof, and she said she understood that, but would he please be careful? And he said he was being careful, and she said that his definition of careful and her definition of careful were clearly different, and he said he'd been doing this for 20 years without her input, and she said that was apparent from the state of the pipe, and he almost laughed, up there on the frozen roof, which was not ideal for his balance. Samuel had a fever the second week of January, the normal kind that children got in winter, but it ran high enough for 2 days that neither Ethan nor Evelyn slept much, trading off beside the boy's bed through the long nights. And on the second night, Ethan came in to relieve her at 2 in the morning and found her with Samuel's hand in hers, not doing anything, just sitting with him in the dark, her head tilted back against the wall and her eyes closed. And he stood in the doorway for a moment and thought about what it meant that she was there. Samuel recovered by the 5th day, thin and irritable and demanding soup with opinions about which soup, and Nora sat with him and read to him in the long-suffering manner of a sibling who was worried but would not admit it. And Evelyn made 3 different kinds of soup over 2 days, accommodating the opinions without explaining that she was accommodating them, and the house was loud and inconvenient and exhausting, and it was, unmistakably, a home. Ethan thought about that word a lot in January. Home. He had lived in this house for 11 years, and it had been a house in the full sense of that word for a long time, the structure that held his life, the place he slept and worked and kept his children. But there was a difference between a house and a home that he understood better now than he had before October, and the difference was not any single thing but the accumulation of things. Soup made 3 different ways for a sick 8-year-old, a green notebook on the kitchen table, figures in a ledger that balanced now, a child who laughed again, a woman sitting in the dark beside his son because she was there, and that was what you did when someone needed you. He had been afraid of this, he realized. Not of Evelyn specifically, not of the arrangement or the town's opinion, or even the practical complications of the chair. He had been afraid of caring about something again that could be taken from him. Margaret's absence had done something to him that he hadn't fully accounted for. Not grief exactly. Not anymore. Not after 2 years. But a kind of protective numbness that had arranged itself so naturally, he'd mistaken it for practicality. He was a practical man. He did practical things. He didn't need warmth or connection or any of those things that made life complicated and loss unbearable. He had been wrong about that, and he had known he was wrong for months now, and had been getting around to doing something about it. He did something about it on a Thursday in the last week of January. The children were at the schoolhouse, both of them. The first day Samuel had been well enough to go back, and Nora had appointed herself escort, and had done it with such authority that Samuel had barely complained about it. The house was quiet in the particular way it was quiet when the children were gone, a different quality of silence than the early morning or the evening, and Evelyn was at her desk by the east window in the good morning light, writing in the notebook, which she'd stopped being self-conscious about in front of him sometime around December. He came to the doorway. "Evelyn," he said. She looked up. He had thought about what he was going to say and had concluded that thinking about it more wasn't going to make it better, so he said it the way he said most things, straight, without ornamentation, which was the only way he knew how, and which she had come to understand was not a failing, but a manner. "I want to marry you," he said, properly. Not the arrangement, not the original agreement. "I want to marry you because I want to, and because I think you want to, and because this is your home and I'd like it to be officially your home, and I'd like you to be officially my wife, and I'd like the children to have that. He paused. And I'd like it for myself, not because it's practical, because it's what I want. She looked at him from the desk by the east window, in the morning light that came in the way he'd told her it would when they first looked at the room together. And her face did several things in quick succession that he watched without trying to interpret any of them individually because they were happening too fast. Then she said, "That was almost a speech." "Don't make something of it," he said. "I'm not," she said. But her mouth was doing the thing, the almost smile that was more specific than a real smile because it was hers and not performed for anyone. "Well?" he said. She closed the notebook. She looked at him with the look she used when she was about to say something she'd been thinking about for longer than the conversation suggested. "I want to marry you," she said. "I want to be here. I want to be their mother, officially, if they want that." A pause. "Do they know you were going to ask me?" "Samuel does," Ethan said. "He told me to do it 2 weeks ago and said I was taking too long." She did laugh then. A real one, the kind that came up unexpectedly, and it changed her whole face the way it always did, and he watched it happen and thought that Margaret would have liked her. He didn't know where that thought came from, but it arrived with certainty and he let it stay. "And Nora?" Evelyn said when the laugh had settled. "Nora said she'd already decided," Ethan said. "When?" "November, apparently." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "That child," she said softly, and there was something in it that was not quite maternal and not quite friendship, but was something specific that didn't need a name. "Is that a yes?" he said. "Yes, Ethan," she said. "That's a yes." Oops. They told the children that evening. Samuel received the news with the particular energy of someone who had been waiting for the conclusion of a thing he'd known was coming, and expressed his approval by immediately wanting to discuss logistics, specifically whether there would be cake and whether he could invite Roy Engel's boy. Nora said nothing for a long moment, and Ethan watched her face and thought he recognized what was happening under it, the complicated mathematics of a child who had lost one mother and was now being offered something she wanted and was afraid to want too simply. Evelyn let the silence sit. She didn't rush Nora, didn't fill it with reassurance, which was, Ethan thought, exactly right. After a moment, Nora looked at Evelyn directly and said, "You're going to stay." "Yes," Evelyn said, "even when it's hard." "Even when it's hard," Evelyn said, "which it will be. This place is not easy." Nora nodded slowly. "Okay," she said, and then, after a beat, very quietly, "I'm glad." She went back to her book. Samuel went back to his logistics. Ethan and Evelyn sat at the kitchen table and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said, and sometimes the right response to a thing going right was just to let it. Chess. The wedding happened on a Saturday in the middle of March, when the worst of the winter had finally broken, and the ground was still too cold for planting. But the sky had started showing blue again between the clouds. That particular pale Montana blue that looked like the sky was new. It was not a large event. They hadn't wanted large. They'd discussed it, briefly, practically, the way they discussed most things, and agreed that what they wanted was real rather than grand, which in Hollow Creek in 1879 meant the county judge, who doubled as a notary, and a handful of people who had earned the right to be there. Tom Briggs came, and Ruth Hadley came, and Ruth's husband Donald, and Roy Engel and his wife Helen, who had made something in a tin that turned out to be a very good apple cake, which addressed Samuel's earlier logistical concern about dessert. Edna Marsh from the general store came, because Edna had spoken up for Evelyn in the hardware store that day, and Evelyn had not forgotten it. The postmaster came because Tom had invited him, and nobody argued. They did it outside, in the yard in front of the house, because Evelyn had said she wanted to be able to see the land. The judge read the words, and Ethan said his and Evelyn said hers, and her voice was steady the whole way through, which Ethan had expected, and his voice was mostly steady, which he had not been entirely sure about. He had bought a ring in town, a plain silver band with a small engraved edge, nothing elaborate. He put it on her finger and it fit because he had asked Ruth to quietly find out the size in a way that Ruth had managed with uncharacteristic subtlety. When it was done, Nora, who was standing beside Evelyn, reached over and took Evelyn's hand, and that was the moment Ethan almost lost his composure, standing in the March cold in the yard of his own ranch. And he looked up at the sky briefly, the way men do when they are trying to hold something in, and took a breath, and held it together. After the ceremony, Ruth appeared at his elbow. "She's good for you," Ruth said. "I know," Ethan said. "I'm going to say I knew it all along." "You're going to be wrong, but you're going to say it anyway." Ruth smiled, which was a real smile, not the organizing smile she usually had on. "That's generally how I operate." She squeezed his arm briefly, which from Ruth was enormous warmth. "Be good to her." "That's the plan," he said. Spring arrived by degrees, the way it always did in Montana. Not a single moment, but a slow accumulation of signs. The frost pulling back from the mornings, the creek running faster under the thinning ice, the first mud appearing in the paddock and being complained about by everyone except Samuel, who found mud categorically interesting. The kitchen garden, which had been more or less abandoned for 2 years, was dug out and replanted, and this was a joint operation of some chaos. Evelyn directed from the path that ran along the garden's edge. Nora dug with concentrated effort, and Samuel contributed enthusiasm and intermittent information about which vegetables were historically significant, which nobody had asked for, and everyone received. The garden grew. That was the thing. It grew unspectacularly in the way gardens do when someone is paying attention to them again. By June, there were beans climbing the fence line and tomatoes starting to set, and a row of herbs that Evelyn had added because she wanted them, and Ethan had said nothing to stop her. Roy Engel came by in May to return a borrowed tool and stayed for coffee, and Ethan watched him talk to Evelyn about the spring planting. The two of them bent over the fence at the garden's edge, Roy pointing at something in the soil, and Evelyn listening and then asking a question that made Roy think. And when Roy left, he said to Ethan, "She's sharp, your wife," and said it with a directness that meant it was a real observation and not a performance of changed opinion. "I know," Ethan said. Roy nodded. He got on his horse. He looked at the ranch, at the fresh-painted fence along the front pasture, which Ethan had finally gotten to, at the kitchen garden visible over the low wall, at the house, which was still not a prosperous-looking property, but which had a quality now that it had lacked before, something inhabited and ongoing. "Place looks better," Roy said. "Does," Ethan agreed. Roy rode off. Ethan went back inside. There was a morning in June, a Tuesday, that Ethan would think about afterward for a long time, not because anything remarkable happened in it, but because of what it was made of. He had come in from the early chores at 7, and the kitchen was already in motion. Evelyn at the stove, Nora setting the table with the particular care she brought to tasks she decided were worth doing right. Samuel at the kitchen table finishing something he'd been writing the night before, his tongue between his teeth, his pen moving fast. The smell of coffee and eggs, and the sound of the morning, and the light coming in through the east window at an angle that hit the kitchen table and made everything in that band of light very specific and real. The salt shaker, Samuel's ink bottle, the edge of the green notebook on its shelf where Evelyn always put it, the grain of the wood. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment before anyone noticed him. He thought, this is it. Not some version of it, not an approximation of it. This is the thing itself. He had spent a long time, longer than 2 years if he was honest. It had started before Margaret died in the last year when the ranch was struggling and the worry was constant, and he had stopped being able to find the thing inside himself that was separate from the problems. He had spent a long time not believing that ordinary mornings were enough, that they were in fact the point. He had been waiting for the situation to resolve, for the struggle to ease, for some condition to be met before he allowed himself to be present in his own life. There was a thing Evelyn had said to Nora in the East Room in November, when she thought he wasn't listening. I find the next thing I can actually do something about. And I do that thing. She'd said it about fear. But it was also, he had come to understand, a whole philosophy of living, and she applied it not selectively but completely, to fear, to grief, to limitation, to love, to the irreversible things that happen to a person, and could not be undone no matter how much you wanted them to be. She had fallen from a balcony protecting her sister. She had woken up in a world that had reclassified her and had spent 4 years refusing to accept the new classification. Not loudly, not with proclamation, but with the steady insistence of someone who did the next thing and the next thing and the next thing until the accumulation of those things was a life, a real one, lived on her own terms. He had not understood, when her letter first arrived, what he was agreeing to. He had thought he was being practical. He had thought he was solving a problem, the children, the household, the loneliness that he hadn't admitted was loneliness. He had not understood that she would walk into his half-empty house and, without trying to fix it, without announcing what she was doing, simply begin to inhabit it fully, and that the fullness of her inhabiting it would change the air in the rooms and the sounds in the mornings, and the way his children looked at the world, and the way he himself had started, slowly, to look at it. You cannot plan for that kind of person. You can only recognize them when they arrive and have the sense not to turn them away. Nora looked up and saw him in the doorway. "You're letting cold air in," she said. He stepped inside and closed the door. "Eggs are almost ready," Evelyn said without turning from the stove. "Samuel, put the pen down." "I'm almost finished," Samuel said. "You've been almost finished for 20 minutes. This part is important. The eggs are also important. Put it down." Samuel put it down with the dramatic reluctance of someone who wants it, noted that he is making a sacrifice. Nora put the last fork in its place and stepped back to assess the table with the faint satisfaction of a person whose standards have been met. Ethan sat down. The eggs came to the table and the coffee came, and the morning arranged itself around the four of them, ordinary and specific and unrepeatable, because no morning is exactly like another even when they seem to be, and this one had the June light in it, and the smell of the kitchen garden through the window. Evelyn had opened a crack, and Samuel's ink-stained fingers, and Nora's particular silence, which was not the silence of 2 years ago, not the silence of a child who had gone away somewhere and might not come back, but the silence of a person who was present and thinking and simply didn't feel the need to fill every space with noise. "Can I ask something?" Samuel said. "You can ask," Evelyn said. "When I'm grown up and I have a ranch," he said, "can I have a map room? Just a room that's only for maps." Ethan looked at him. "A whole room." "Maps take up space," Samuel said. "You need room for them." "We live on the frontier," Ethan said. "We don't have rooms to spare for single purposes." "Yet," Samuel said. Evelyn was looking at her coffee cup in a way that meant she was working very hard not to smile. Nora gave Samuel the look of a sibling who finds someone simultaneously exasperating and entertaining. "Yet," Ethan said. Samuel nodded, satisfied, and went back to his eggs. The wire from Richmond came in August. Tom Briggs brought it out himself, which Ethan recognized as a deliberate choice. Good news or bad, Tom preferred to deliver things in person. He rode up on a Wednesday afternoon, and Evelyn was in the garden, and the children were doing their figures at the kitchen table, and something about the way Tom dismounted, without the fast urgency of December, without the pained deliberateness of a man carrying something heavy, told Ethan before the conversation started which direction it was going. The formal inquiry into Garrett Voss had concluded. It had not concluded in the dramatic way of stories. There was no trial, no dramatic public reckoning, no single moment where justice announced itself. What there was a finding, a formal legal finding that Voss had engaged in a coordinated campaign of harassment and intimidation targeting the family of a deceased federal judge, and that the evidence, including the incident in Hollow Creek the previous December, was sufficient to refer the matter to federal jurisdiction. Voss had, through his attorneys, agreed to a settlement that involved significant financial penalties, and more importantly, a binding legal agreement that severed all connection to or action against the Dorset family name in perpetuity. His attorneys had negotiated hard for that language, the settlement, not the trial, and the Richmond Law Office believed they had done so because Voss understood that a trial was a thing he could not survive publicly, whatever the legal outcome. It was not everything. Evelyn knew that, and Ethan knew it, and Tom knew it too. A man like Voss, contained rather than punished, was still a man like Voss. The people he had heard over the years, the rulings he had corrupted, the woman who had fallen from a balcony and lost the use of her legs because of his choices, none of that was returned, repaired, or reversed by a settlement agreement and a financial penalty. The law had done what the law could do, and what the law could do was limited in the way that human systems are always limited when they try to quantify what cannot be quantified. But the account was closed. And Evelyn Dorset Calloway, sitting on the porch of the ranch with the wire in her hands and the August afternoon warm around her, read it twice and then folded it neatly and set it on her lap. "Well," she said. Tom waited. "Thank you, Tom," she said, "for everything this past year." Tom turned his hat in his hands. "It was the job," he said, which was Tom's version of "you're welcome." After he left, she sat on the porch for a while. Ethan didn't go out immediately. He watched her through the window the way he'd watched her in moments throughout the past year, from the sideline, giving her space to have the thing privately before the world came back in. She sat with her hands in her lap and the folded wire beside her and the wide Montana afternoon in front of her, and he could not see her face from the angle he was at, only her profile and the particular set of her shoulders. He went out after a while and pulled the other chair onto the porch and sat down beside her. She didn't say anything immediately. Neither did he. A hawk was working the field to the south, riding a thermal in long, lazy circles, and the kitchen garden was green and full, and the fence along the front pasture was painted, and the barn door, which had needed a new hinge for 2 years, had a new hinge on it that Ethan had finally gotten to in July. "It doesn't feel the way I thought it would," she said finally. "What did you think it would feel like?" She was quiet for a moment. "Relief, maybe, or, I don't know, something bigger than this." She looked at the wire in her lap. "It just feels like something ending that was already mostly over." She paused. "The fear ended months ago. The looking over my shoulder, that was already gone. This is just the paper that says so officially." He nodded. He understood that. The most important things rarely announce themselves with the drama that the paperwork around them suggested. 4 years, she said. "I spent 4 years being afraid. Not always actively, but it was always there. This thing waiting." She looked out at the field. "And now it's not. How does that feel?" She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about things she wanted to answer honestly. "Like, I have to figure out what I was going to do with all that space once there was nothing filling it," she said, which turns out to be something I haven't had to think about before. "You've got time," he said. "I know." She looked at him sideways. "I have opinions about the garden. I've noticed. I want to expand it next year, past the south fence line. That's goat territory." "I know. I have opinions about that too." He looked at her. "We're not getting goats, Evelyn." "Not yet," she said. He almost argued the point, and then he saw the corner of her mouth, and he let it go. And the afternoon went on around them, warm and unhurried, the hawk still circling in the blue distance, the ranch doing what ranches do, existing, requiring, continuing. People in Hollow Creek told different versions of the story for years afterward. Some of them were mostly true. Some of them had acquired, in the telling, the particular embellishments that attached to stories people wanted to mean something. The stranger made more menacing, the confrontation more dramatic, the transformation of the town's opinion tidier and faster than it had actually been. The truth was messier. The truth was that some people in Hollow Creek changed how they thought about Evelyn Calloway, and some didn't, and some changed partway and then backslid, and some who had been unkind were later kind and never acknowledged the shift, and some who had been kind from the start got less credit than they were due because that's how public memory works. What was accurate was this. In the years that followed, the Calloway Ranch was a place people knew. Not famous, not legendary, in any large sense. It was a ranch on the Montana frontier, not a city on a hill. But known in the specific way that some people and places become known in a community because what happens there is real and what comes out of it is real, and the people running it are recognizably, imperfectly, genuinely themselves. Nora Calloway, at 15, was teaching the younger children at the schoolhouse 2 afternoons a week, not because anyone had asked her to, but because she decided it was a thing she could do and wanted to. She was not a performer, not in any sense. She still preferred silence to noise, still had the quality of a person who was present in a room without announcing it. But she was no longer the child who had gone away somewhere inside herself. She had come back, and the self she'd come back to was more complete than the one she'd had before, because loss does that sometimes when you survive it. It teaches you what the things you still have are actually worth. Samuel Calloway did not get a map room, because the ranch still didn't have a room to spare for a single purpose. But he had covered 3 walls of his bedroom with maps of his own making, and by the time he was 12, the school teacher had started sending him questions she couldn't answer. He was not a straightforward boy, not easy. Had his mother's stubbornness in him and his father's difficulty with saying things plainly. And he and Ethan argued regularly about practical matters and about impractical ones, and it was real, the kind of friction that exists between people who are similar enough to irritate each other and care enough not to walk away from it. Ethan Calloway worked the land, the way he'd always worked the land, and it didn't get dramatically easier in the years after Evelyn arrived, because land and weather and cattle and the economics of the frontier don't reorganize themselves around a man's domestic happiness. There were hard years. A bad winter in 1882 that took a third of the herd, a dry summer in 1884 that killed half the kitchen garden and sent everyone's tempers up. And there were better years, and through all of them the ranch continued, which was what ranches were supposed to do. What changed in Ethan was harder to name precisely. He was still a practical man, still not given to long speeches or displays of sentiment, still the kind of person who showed what he meant more reliably than he said it. But the numbness he'd mistaken for practicality was gone. He was present in his own life in a way he hadn't been for years. Not perfectly, not always. He had bad days and distracted days and days when the weight of the work and the worry landed on him in ways he didn't handle gracefully. But he was there. He was in the kitchen in the mornings and at the table in the evenings and in all the ordinary hours of the days that were not extraordinary and never would be. And that was, he had come to understand, the entire thing. That was all of it. The ordinary hours were the life. Evelyn Dorset Calloway was not, in any version of the story, a simple figure. She was not a symbol. She was not a lesson in human resilience neatly packaged for the consumption of people who needed to feel better about difficulty. She was a specific woman with a specific history who had made specific choices under specific pressure and had gotten some of them right and some of them wrong, and she would have been the first to say so and the last to want to be made into a parable. She had used her sister's name, which was a deception, and she had done it because the world had given her reasons to believe she would not be seen clearly as herself. And those reasons were not paranoid projections, but accurate assessments based on 4 years of evidence. She had arrived in a strange place and had found, improbably, that it could hold her. Not because it was kind to her, not because the people in it were uncomplicated, but because she worked at it and she was honest about what she was, and she did not wait for permission to matter. The thing about the chair, the thing people missed when they thought they were being generous about the chair, was that it was never, for Evelyn, the most important thing about her situation. The most important thing was the same thing that is always the most important thing about any person's situation, whether they are seen. Whether the people around them look past the surface category and find the actual person who is doing the actual living inside the actual circumstances. The chair was one of her circumstances. It was not her. And the people who eventually understood that, Nora, who had understood it nearly from the start, Samuel, who had understood it in the uncomplicated way children sometimes understand things that adults complicate, Ethan, who had needed more time but had gotten there, and eventually, unevenly, imperfectly, the town itself, were better for the understanding, not because it made them more charitable about disability, though perhaps it did that too, but because the practice of seeing a person clearly, past your assumptions and your categories and your own discomfort, is a practice that improves everything you apply it to. There is a version of this story that is about a woman in a wheelchair who proved everyone wrong. Evelyn would have found that version reductive and a little insulting. She was not in the business of proving things to people who hadn't asked to be proven to. She was in the business of living her life, and the living of it happened to be visible. And what people saw in it, they were free to take or leave. What Ethan saw, kneeling in front of her on their wedding day, because he had knelt, in the way he had seen himself doing in his head when he thought about this moment, not for drama, but because he had wanted to be at her level, to look at her straight on rather than down. What Ethan saw was the woman who had shown up at his train station in October with a suitcase on her lap and a storybook under her arm, and her chin up against the staring, and who had not asked to be pitied, and had not performed strength for the crowd, and had simply been herself, clearly and completely. And let that be what it was. He had not had the words for it then. He had them now, or something close to them. The inadequate words of a practical man who had learned, slowly and at some cost, that being practical and being fully human were not in conflict, that you could keep the accounts and feel the weight of an ordinary morning, that the most important things in a life were not the dramatic confrontations or the resolutions or the formal ends of threats, but the Tuesday breakfast and the kitchen lamp burning late, and the voice of a child who had been silent and was not silent anymore. He told her some of this, standing in the yard in March with the pale blue sky above them, and Tom Briggs and Roy Engel and Ruth Hadley watching, told her enough of it that she looked at him with an expression he'd never seen on her before. Unguarded, fully open, the composed surface of her gone for a moment. And what was under it was not the soft thing that people expected to see when composure dropped. It was something fiercer than that, something that had been through the real difficulty and was still standing and knew it. "I know," she said, which was what she always said when she meant it the most. On the Montana frontier, in a small town that was mostly not kind and sometimes was, in a house that still needed paint in places and always needed something, Evelyn Dorset Calloway built a life that was equal to everything she had survived to get to it. Not a perfect life, not a smooth one, not a life that proved anything or redeemed anything or resolved the unfairness of what had happened to her into something narratively satisfying. A real life, with a man who was better at showing than saying, and 2 children who were imperfect and difficult and completely themselves, and a kitchen garden that grew because someone was paying attention, and a green notebook on a shelf in the east room where the morning light came in, the way she'd known it would. She had crossed half a continent on a chance.
Oh, he directed the Spider-Man. Oh, he did. Oh, shit. Okay. That's pretty cool that he also does horror from time to time, too. I love it when people are not a one note, like just doing like one thing versus another. I really like that track, damn it. I want to know what that track was. Shit. Might be unreleased. That had the good wubs just now. He's really into comment. Oh, he did do Cabin in the Woods. No fucking way. Hello, Aranita. Welcome in. Okay, then I think I would like that movie with Rachel McAdams, because I really liked Cabin in the Woods and it was fucking